In the chilled aisles of a supermarket, a millionaire was selecting expensive wines when he felt a desperate tug on his trousers. A 6-year-old girl, clutching a milk carton with urgency, made a proposal that froze his blood. "If you buy me this milk, I'll tell you a secret about the pretty lady who always came here with you." Intrigued by the specific mention, he reluctantly agreed. What the child revealed made his world collapse. Arthur Sterling felt the chill of the dairy aisle seep into the expensive fabric of his cashmere coat. It was an artificial, sterile cold, nothing like the crisp morning air he and Laura used to enjoy on the deck of their mountain home. Here, in the perfectly climate-controlled environment of the city's most exclusive gourmet market, everything was controlled, predictable, and soulless. Just as his life had become over the past year. He pushed the cart with one hand, the cold metal an uncomfortable counterpoint to the warmth that still lingered in his chest at the thought of her. His eyes scanned the shelves filled with imported cheeses and artisanal yogurts, but he saw nothing. His mind was miles away, trapped in a cycle of memories that hurt as much as they comforted. Laura would know exactly which Greek yogurt to grab. She'd tease him about his indecision, her eyes sparkling with that gentle humor he loved so much. He sighed, the sound lost in the constant hum of the refrigerators. All his immense wealth, built over years of shrewd stock market investments and high-stakes ventures, couldn't buy him a single moment more with her. Money was just a palliative, a shield against the real world, but useless against the pain of absence. He was about to grab any product and head for the fine wine section, his true objective that afternoon, when he felt a light, yet insistent, tug on the hem of his tailored trousers. Surprised, he looked down. A little girl, no older than 6, stared up at him with a seriousness that didn't belong to her age. Her dark hair was tangled, pulled back in a loose ponytail, and her dress, though clean, was visibly worn and a size too small for her thin frame. But it was her eyes that caught Arthur's attention. Large and brown, they held none of the shyness expected of a child, but a fierce determination, an intelligence that seemed sharpened by necessity. In her small hands, she held a carton of whole milk, as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. Arthur frowned, a wave of compassion mixed with a slight discomfort washing over him. He wasn't used to being approached like this, especially not in this sanctuary of wealth and privilege. His first inclination, shaped by a lifetime of impulsive generosity, was to solve the problem immediately. He knelt down, trying to soften his expression. "Hello, do you need help?" he asked, his voice gentler than he intended. The girl didn't smile. She just clutched the milk carton tighter. "Can you buy it for me, mister?" she asked, her voice low but clear, without a hint of hesitation. "My mom, she's not here." Arthur felt a pang in his heart. He imagined the girl was lost. Perhaps her mother was in another aisle. It was simple. He pulled his wallet from his pocket. An automatic gesture. He had more money than he could ever spend. A carton of milk was less than nothing. It was dust in his vast cash flow. "Of course, little one. I'll get it for you. You can pick out anything else you'd like," he offered, a paternal smile beginning to form on his lips. He expected a look of relief, perhaps a grateful smile. Instead, the girl shook her head, her expression growing even more intense. "No, I don't want it for free," she said, and the words took Arthur completely by surprise. "It's a trade." Arthur blinked, confused. "A trade? What do you have to trade?" The girl took a step closer, her eyes fixed on his, as if measuring his soul. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, forcing him to lean in further. "If you buy me this milk," she said, each word carefully pronounced, "I'll tell you a secret. A secret about the pretty lady who always came here with you." The air froze in Arthur's lungs. The hum of the refrigerators seemed to silence, and the world narrowed to that pair of serious brown eyes. The pretty lady, that's what he called her, Laura. How could this child know? Time seemed to stretch and fold around the girl's words. The pretty lady, Laura. The tender nickname he used only between them, whispered in moments of intimacy, now came from the lips of a complete stranger. Arthur's logic, the sharp mind that made him a multimillionaire before 30, struggled to find a rational explanation. A coincidence, a lucky guess. But the specificity of the term, combined with the intensity of the child's gaze, disarmed his defenses. The skepticism that protected him in boardrooms full of corporate sharks dissolved before that small figure. The grief, always lurking beneath the surface of his composure, emerged with overwhelming force. He felt exposed, vulnerable. "How?" he began, his voice failing. "How do you know that?" The girl didn't look away. She seemed to understand the power of the information she held. "I see things," she replied enigmatically. "I pay attention. People talk a lot when they think no one's listening." Arthur felt a shiver. He and Laura used to talk in this very aisle, about their dreams, their fears, about the illness that was slowly consuming her. He always thought their conversations were private bubbles amidst the anonymous crowd. The idea that someone, especially a child, could have witnessed those intimate moments was deeply unsettling. He needed more. He needed proof. His mind, trained to assess risks and returns in any investment, demanded assurance before surrendering to that current of emotions. "What kind of secret?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but the eagerness was palpable. The girl seemed to hesitate, her eyes darting quickly from side to side like a startled animal. She leaned in a little closer, and the faint scent of stored fabric and childhood hunger reached him. "The last time you two came together," she whispered, "the pretty lady was tired. She leaned on the cart, right here." The girl pointed to an exact spot, near the bottles of liquid yogurt. "Oh, she told you that the lights looked like blurry stars and that she just wanted to go home and sleep in your lap. And you said you'd build her a bed made of clouds if you could." The air was stolen from Arthur's lungs. The memory hit him like a physical wave, so vivid he could feel the weight of Laura's head on his shoulder, hear her weak breath. No one else was around. He was sure. It was a moment of silent despair, one of many that marked the end of her life. How? How could this disheveled child know the most painfully intimate details of their farewell? The trade she proposed was no longer a plea for charity. It was a transaction of incalculable value. All his fortune, his empire of businesses and assets, seemed insignificant compared to the key that little girl seemed to hold. The key to understanding Laura's last days, perhaps in a way he never could. "The milk," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I'll buy the milk. And whatever else you need." For the first time, a glimpse of relief passed across the child's face. "My little brother is sick," she confessed, her tough negotiator facade finally cracking a little. "He needs the milk, that's all." The urgency in her voice was real, desperate. Arthur stood up, the decision made. He took the carton of milk from her hand and placed it in his cart. He added a few more items: bread, cheese, fruit, juice, without asking, acting on a protective instinct he hadn't felt in a long time. He guided her silently to the checkout, a powerful man and a wisp of a child forming an unlikely alliance under the fluorescent lights. After paying, he turned to her in the tense silence near the exit. "Now," he said softly, "the secret." The girl clutched the bag tightly, her knuckles white. She looked over her shoulder, towards the supermarket entrance, her eyes widening with sudden fear. "Not here," she whispered, panic sharpening her voice. "He might see us. Your friend, the one who was with her when you weren't." Arthur's confusion twisted into a cold knot in his stomach. Friend? He only had one friend who fit that description, someone so close he was practically a brother. Richard, his business partner, the best man at his wedding, the man who held him during Laura's funeral. The idea was absurd, a poison his mind refused to absorb. Richard adored Laura. He saw her as the anchor that kept Arthur grounded, the heart of his frantic life of business and investments. Richard's loyalty was one of the few certainties left in Arthur's universe, as solid as the value of gold in times of crisis. "No, you must be mistaken," he said, more to himself than to the girl. "My friend, he barely came here." But even as he denied it, a seed of doubt was planted in the fertile ground of his grief. The girl, who introduced herself as Leah, shook her head with unwavering conviction. "I'm not. It was him, the tall man who always smiles, but his smile doesn't reach his eyes. He always brought her orange juice. That brand over there." She pointed to a distant shelf, her photographic memory capturing a trivial detail that suddenly seemed to carry monumental weight. Arthur closed his eyes, forcing himself to remember. Yes, Laura had developed a taste for that specific brand of orange juice in her last months. He thought it was just a craving, a small source of comfort amidst her suffering. Richard sometimes showed up unexpectedly at the market to keep them company, a gesture Arthur had always interpreted as the purest altruism. He now saw these visits in a new light, twisted and sinister. What else hadn't he seen? What was happening right under his nose? While he was blinded by grief and denial, his control, his ability to read people and situations which had earned him a fortune, had failed spectacularly in the most important area of his life. He looked at Leah, at the genuine fear in her eyes, and realized he could no longer treat this as a childish delusion. There was something terribly real here. "We need to leave," he said, his voice taking on the commanding tone he used to close multi-million-dollar deals. "I'll take you and your brother somewhere safe." "Where do you live?" Leah hesitated, the innate distrust of someone who lived on the streets battling against the urgency of her situation. "It's not far," she said evasively, "but I can't leave Leo alone for too long." Arthur nodded, the mention of her little brother reinforcing his determination. He didn't know what dark secret he was about to unearth, but he knew with chilling clarity that these two children were at the center of everything, and that he would protect them with all the resources his vast capital could buy. He led them out of the gourmet market, the late afternoon light momentarily blinding them. The contrast between the cool interior and the warmth of the parking lot was stark. He led them to his car, a luxury sedan worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Leah looked at the vehicle with admiration, but without the greed Arthur was accustomed to seeing. For her, it wasn't a status symbol, it was a fortress, an escape. She gave him directions in a low voice, guiding him away from the upscale neighborhoods and towards a part of the city Arthur only saw from above, from the windows of his financial district office. The streets narrowed, the buildings lost color and integrity. The scent of wealth and privilege was replaced by the smell of dampness and desperation. Finally, Leah pointed to a dark brick building with broken windows that looked like empty eyes and a graffiti-covered metal door. "It's here," she whispered, and the tone of her voice was not of shame, but of simple resignation. Arthur parked the car, its silent engine sounding like an affront to the surrounding decay. He looked at the building, a place the city council should have condemned years ago, and felt the carefully constructed ground of his world begin to tremble. The place wasn't a home. It was an abandoned shelter, a ruin forgotten by God and man, and inside was a sick boy and the terrifying truth he had promised to protect. The air inside the shelter was heavy, laden with the smell of mold and old dust. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the filthy windows, casting golden shafts that only accentuated the desolation of the place. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of Arthur's footsteps on the cracked concrete floor and the soft rustle of Leah's grocery bag. She led him down a dark corridor, past open doors that revealed empty rooms, filled with broken furniture and debris. It was a ghost of a place, haunted by the lives it once held. Arthur, a man accustomed to environments where every detail was designed to inspire power and success, felt like an intruder in a world of raw survival. His net worth An astronomical figure that filled the pages of business magazines seemed like an absurd fiction in that setting. Leah stopped before a door at the end of the corridor and pushed it open. The room was small and almost bare, except for an old mattress in the corner, covered by a thin sheet. On the mattress, huddled under a worn blanket, lay a tiny boy. His hair was as dark as Leah's, and his skin had an unhealthy pallor. He coughed, a dry, weak sound that echoed in the silent room. "Leo," Leah whispered, rushing to his side. She placed the bag on the floor and touched her brother's forehead with a tenderness that contrasted violently with the harshness of the environment. "I brought milk and bread." The boy, Leo, slowly opened his eyes. They were the same large, intelligent eyes as his sister, but clouded by fever and weakness. He offered a small smile at the sight of the milk carton, a glimmer of childish joy amidst the misery. Arthur stood at the doorway, a wave of conflicting emotions paralyzing him. There was anger at a system that allowed children to live like this. There was guilt, the guilt of the privileged, living in a bubble of comfort, oblivious to such suffering. And above all, there was a growing connection to these two children, a responsibility that solidified with each passing second. Leah was incredibly skilled. With a dull kitchen knife she pulled from a small backpack. She opened the milk carton and poured it into a cracked plastic cup. She helped her brother sit up and held the cup for him, watching him drink in slow, laborious sips. In that simple gesture, Arthur saw a lifetime of care and resilience. Leah wasn't just an older sister. She was a mother, a protector, a miniature warrior. "Now, the secret," Arthur said softly. After Leo had finished the milk and snuggled back under the blanket, he didn't want to pressure her, but urgency consumed him. The image of Richard smiling in his memory now seemed a grotesque mask. Leah stood up and walked over to him, her eyes serious again. She led him into the hallway, away from her brother's ears. "I saw him," she began, her voice a tense whisper. "Many times. Your friend. He met the pretty lady here at the market. She looked sad. And he always brought the juice. He'd open the bottle for her, but once I saw him put something inside, a tiny thing, a little white powder from an unmarked packet. He was very quick. He thought no one was watching. But I saw." Arthur's world tilted on its axis. A little white powder. Poison. The word exploded in his mind. So shocking and unreal he almost laughed. Richard, poisoning Laura. Why? For control of the company. For money. It made no sense. Their capital was intertwined, but trust was the foundation of everything. They built an empire together. Richard didn't need more money. He was already a man of immense wealth. She drank the juice, and then she got more tired. Leah continued, her voice trembling slightly. She complained of dizziness. "Do you remember? She said it was her sickness, but it was him. He did that to her." The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, forming a horrifying picture. Laura's slow, inexplicable deterioration, the doctor's confusing diagnoses, which finally settled on a rare and incurable neurodegenerative disease, the symptoms that came and went, the weakness that consumed her day by day, everything aligned with the terrible possibility of systematic, long-term poisoning. Arthur's blind trust in his best friend had been the perfect weapon. He looked at the girl in front of him, this small orphan who survived by observing others, and realized that her photographic memory was not just a skill, it was a weapon. She was the only witness to an unthinkable act. And suddenly, the fear he saw in her eyes at the market made perfect sense. It wasn't the fear of a child asking for help. It was the fear of a witness who knew she was in the presence of someone very, very dangerous. The revelation fell upon Arthur with the weight of a granite slab, suffocating the air from his lungs and turning the world into a distant hum. Richard, his sole brother, the architect of their joint success, the pillar he leaned on when his world collapsed. The image of him, smiling and handing Laura a juice, was now stained with the indelible mark of poison. Every gesture of friendship, every word of comfort, every comforting embrace transformed into a facet of a betrayal so deep it seemed inconceivable. Arthur's obsession with control had always been his driving force. He believed that with enough resources and planning, he could mitigate any risk, solve any problem. Yet, the most devastating threat didn't come from a business rival or a stock market crash, but from within his innermost circle, disguised as loyalty. He felt like a fool, a billionaire fool, whose vast fortune couldn't protect him from the simplest and cruelest of human deceits. He looked at Leah, who watched him with a wisdom that belied her age. She didn't seem surprised by his shock, as if she expected this reaction. She lived in a world where betrayal was common currency. "We need a doctor for your brother," Arthur said, his voice sounding strange and distant to his own ears. It was the only concrete thing he could focus on, an immediate action to combat the chaos that had settled in his mind. Protecting these children was now a moral imperative, a small act of redemption in a world that had suddenly lost all meaning. "And you two need to get out of here, now." Leah nodded, the practicality of the survivor overcoming any other emotion. "We can't go to a hospital," she said firmly. "They'd ask questions, they'd separate us." The fear in her voice was palpable. To her, the threat of separation was as terrifying as Leo's illness or the dangerous man she had observed. Arthur understood. The system, which should protect them, was seen by them as another predator. He would need to use his resources differently, circumventing the official channels that now seemed dangerously inadequate. He pulled out his cell phone, his hands trembling slightly. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years, that of a private doctor, Dr. Peterson, an elderly and discreet man who owed the Sterling family favors for decades. He explained the situation vaguely, but urgently: 2 children in need, absolute discretion required. The doctor, without asking questions, agreed to meet them at one of Arthur's properties, a small guest house in an isolated area of the city. While waiting for confirmation, Arthur watched Leah pack her few possessions into a backpack, a teddy bear with one missing eye, a storybook with a torn cover, a few pieces of clothing. These were the wreckage of an interrupted childhood, the only assets of their lives. He thought of the vaults full of gold and the cryptocurrency holdings he possessed. Intangible assets, numbers on a screen. The real treasure, he realized, was the fierce loyalty that girl had for her brother, something he thought he possessed, but had discovered to be an illusion. As he carried little Leo, feverish and fragile, out of the shelter, Arthur felt a purpose that money had never given him. It wasn't about increasing his wealth or closing another profitable deal. It was about protecting innocence, about seeking justice for a stolen life. The drive to the guest house was silent. Leah looked out the window, her eyes absorbing the passing world, always alert, always observing. Arthur, in turn, felt the weight of Richard's gaze on him, even though he wasn't there. Every billboard with a commercial smile, every stranger on the street, seemed to wear his friend's mask. Paranoia began to set in, a cold feeling that he was being watched, that every step he took was monitored. The blind trust that had defined him had shattered, and in its place grew a corrosive suspicion of everything and everyone. Upon arriving at the safe house, a refuge of tranquility nestled in a lush garden, the juxtaposition with the abandoned shelter was almost violent. It was a stark reminder of the world's inequality. But at that moment, the refugee also felt like a golden cage. He had taken the children out of immediate physical danger, but in doing so, he had brought them into the center of his own impending war. A war against a man who knew all his weaknesses, who knew exactly where and how to strike. The arrival of Dr. Peterson was a relief amidst the growing storm in Arthur's mind. The doctor was a white-haired man with gentle manners. whose professional calm was a balm to Arthur's simmering panic. He examined Leo with a patience and care that immediately won Leah's trust, who hovered protectively beside her brother, observing the doctor's every move with her hawk-like eyes. After a thorough examination and collecting blood samples, Dr. Peterson called Arthur to the living room, his expression grave. "The boy is severely malnourished and dehydrated, which was to be expected," he began, his voice low. But there's something else. His symptoms, the lethargy, the muscle aches, the intermittent confusion, are not consistent only with lack of food. There are indications of toxicity. It's as if his body is fighting a strange substance. The doctor's words were like hammer blows, driving the nail of Arthur's suspicion even deeper. The same substance, the same gradual deterioration. It was insane, monstrous, but the connection was undeniable. Richard had not only poisoned Laura, he was using an innocent child, an orphaned boy, as a test, a rehearsal for his heinous crime. The calculated coldness of the act was chilling. "Run all necessary tests, Dr. Peterson. All of them," Arthur said, his voice hard as steel. "Spare no expense. I want to know exactly what's in his system. And I want you to be the only one to have access to the results. No one else. Do you understand?" The doctor nodded, his gaze meeting Arthur's with silent understanding. He might not know the whole story, but he recognized the urgency and danger in his client's voice. He knew he was dealing with something that went far beyond a simple medical matter. While Dr. Peterson tended to Leo, administering fluids and medication, Arthur sat with Leah on the back porch, which overlooked a meticulously kept garden. The contrast between the serene beauty of the place and the ugliness of what they were discussing was surreal. "Leah," he began, choosing his words carefully, "you said your mother wasn't with you. Where is she?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Leah's face, normally so controlled, contorted into an expression of deep pain. "She's gone," she whispered, her eyes fixed on a red rose blooming on a nearby bush. "She worked at the market, stocked shelves at night. She also got sick, the same way the pretty lady did, tired, dizzy. The doctors didn't know what it was. One day, she just didn't wake up anymore." The horror of the situation deepened, layer by layer, revealing an abyss of evil that Arthur could barely comprehend. It wasn't just about Laura. It was a pattern. Richard was eliminating people. But why? Leah's mother, a humble supermarket employee. What could she have known to make her a threat? "Your mother, did she discover something?" Arthur asked, his heart heavy with dread. Leah sniffed, a single tear tracing a path down her dusty cheek. "She was like me. She saw things. She told me the tall man, your friend, did strange things near the juices. He swapped bottles, tampered with batches. She thought he was just a demanding customer at first, but then she started putting the pieces together. She was going to tell the manager, but she got sick before she could. That was it. Leah's mother was the first victim, an inconvenient witness who needed to be silenced, and Richard had used the same cruel, cowardly methodology, a slow poison that mimicked a natural illness, to get rid of her without raising suspicion. Laura wasn't the beginning. She was the continuation, and Leo was the proof of concept, the innocent guinea pig in a diabolical scheme. Arthur felt a wave of fury so intense it made him dizzy. The pain of loss mingled with an overwhelming desire for vengeance, but he knew impulsiveness would be his undoing. Richard was intelligent, methodical, and worst of all, he hid in plain sight, protected by an impeccable reputation and the trust of everyone around him. Accusing him without concrete evidence would be social and professional suicide. Richard would paint him as a man driven mad by grief. Exploiting two orphaned children to fuel his delusions, he needed irrefutable proof, and the key to that proof was in the blood of the boy sleeping in the next room. The following days dragged on in a fog of anxiety and secret planning. The guest house became a fortress, a sanctuary isolated from the outside world. Arthur used his vast network of contacts not to close deals or speculate on the stock market, but to build a wall of protection around Leah and Leo. He hired discreet security guards to patrol the property's perimeter and instructed his personal staff to cancel all his meetings, citing a family emergency. To the world, he was a grieving man needing seclusion. To himself, he was a general preparing for the battle of his life. Leo's health slowly improved under Dr. Peterson's care. With proper nutrition and the absence of the toxin, a little color returned to his cheeks, and his eyes lost some of their feverish haze. He began to speak, revealing a sweet and curious personality that had been suffocated by illness. He clung to Arthur with the innocent trust of a child, seeing in him a paternal and protective figure. Every faint smile from Leo was a stab in Arthur's heart, a reminder of what Richard had tried to destroy. While waiting for the toxicology results, Arthur and Leah spent hours talking. He was amazed by the girl's intelligence and resilience. Her memory was a detailed archive of everything she had observed at the market. She described Richard's routines, his visit times, the types of juice he bought, the conversations she overheard. It was a treasure trove of information that Arthur meticulously noted, searching for patterns, looking for the missing piece. One afternoon, while reviewing his notes, Arthur received a call. It was Richard. The sound of his voice, once so familiar and comforting, now sent a chill down Arthur's spine. "Arthur, my friend, where have you been? Everyone's worried about you. You've disappeared off the map," Richard said, his tone a perfect blend of concern and joviality. "I'm taking some time for myself, Richard. I needed space," Arthur replied, forcing a neutrality he didn't feel. Every word was a performance, an act in a dangerous play. I understand, but you know you can count on me for anything. By the way, I was just thinking about Laura. I remembered that last outing we had, the three of us in the park. She was so happy that day. The casual mention of Laura was like a punch. Richard was playing, testing him, using his most precious memory as a weapon. Anger rose in Arthur's throat, but he swallowed it. "Yes, I remember," he managed to say. "Richard, I need to hang up. I'll talk to you later." He ended the call, his heart pounding wildly. Richard was probing, perhaps suspicious of his silence. Time was running out. Late that afternoon, Dr. Peterson arrived with the results. His expression was grim. He handed an envelope to Arthur. "It's worse than I thought," the doctor said. "The substance in Leo's blood is a rare compound, a slow-acting poison derived from an exotic plant. It's extremely difficult to detect in normal autopsies, as its effects perfectly mimic the symptoms of certain neurodegenerative diseases. There is no known antidote." Arthur felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. It was the proof, the smoking gun, but it was also a death sentence for anyone who had ingested it long enough. Laura. The cause of her death was not a rare disease. It was murder. The truth, which he had sought so desperately, was uglier and more painful than he could ever have imagined. With trembling hands, he opened the report to read the technical details of the compound. His gaze scanned the page, moving past complex chemical terms until a single word leaped out at him, chilling his blood. The scientific name of the plant from which the poison was extracted. He knew it. Laura knew it. It was the same rare and exotic plant that Laura, an amateur botanist, cultivated with such pride in her small private greenhouse in their own backyard. The greenhouse that Richard, a frequent visitor and family friend, had unrestricted access to. The weapon wasn't in a secret lab. It was in their garden all along. The revelation fell upon Arthur like an avalanche, burying him under the weight of cruel and devastating irony. The greenhouse, Laura's small sanctuary of glass and plants, her refuge from the world, the place where she found peace and beauty, that space which Arthur had preserved untouched since her passing, like a sacred memorial, was, in fact, the crime scene, the source of the weapon that destroyed her. He felt violated in a way no financial loss or business betrayal ever could equal. Richard didn't just take Laura's life. He perverted her love, turned her passion into poison. He walked through the rooms of his own house like a ghost, every object, every photograph, now seen through a filter of lies. The image of Richard at his wedding, smiling beside Laura, seemed a mockery. The memory of Richard bringing Laura soup when she was sick, an act of sadistic cruelty. The trust Arthur had placed in him was a weapon he himself had handed to his enemy. He was paralyzed by the enormity of the betrayal, but the sound of Leah's laughter, coming from the garden where she played with Leo, pulled him from his stupor. Responsibility for these children was his anchor to reality, the compass that kept him from drowning in despair and rage. He couldn't fail them as he had failed Laura. He needed a plan, a strategy as meticulous and ruthless as Richard's. Direct action was impossible. Richard had power, influence, and most importantly, everyone's sympathy. The legal system, as Leah instinctively knew, could be easily manipulated. Authorities could dismiss an orphaned child's testimony, especially when confronted with the word of a respected billionaire. Richard could easily legally abduct the children, placing them in an institution under the pretext of protecting them, silencing them forever. Arthur realized he would have to fight Richard's war on his own battlefield. Manipulation and deception. He would need to gather more evidence, create a trap from which Richard could not escape. His obsession with control, once a flaw that blinded him, now needed to become his greatest weapon. He began to act. Through intermediaries and shell companies, he hired a team of the best private investigators in the country. Their mission to investigate every aspect of Richard's life, his finances, his connections, his movements, without leaving a trace. He wanted to know everything, from the stocks Richard traded to the brand of coffee he drank. As the investigation unfolded in the shadows, Arthur maintained his facade. He resumed contact with Richard, feigning a gradual recovery from his grief. The conversations were an agonizing exercise in self-control. He listened to Richard's concerned voice, his offers of help, and responded with rehearsed gratitude, while the urge to scream the truth consumed him. During one of these calls, Richard casually mentioned other names from the city's business elite. "Did you hear about Walter? Died suddenly last week. Heart attack, they said. And Claude's wife, Beatrice, isn't doing well either. A strange degenerative disease. Doctors are stumped." Each name was a stab. Walter, Claude. They were wealthy businessmen, some rivals, others allies, and their wives. They frequented the same gourmet market. A terrible pattern began to emerge from the shadows. It wasn't just about Laura. It wasn't a crime of passion or a personal attack. It was something much bigger, more systematic, and more terrifying. Richard wasn't just eliminating one person. He was conducting a silent, methodical campaign of extermination, using the wives of the elite as pawns to reach their husbands. The motive was still a mystery, but the scale of the plan was chilling. Arthur realized he wasn't just fighting for Laura's justice. He was in a race against time to stop a serial killer hiding behind a mask of normalcy. A man who used poison instead of a weapon and who turned his friends' grief into opportunities. He looked at Leah, who was drawing in a notebook at the kitchen table, and understood the depth of his debt to her. The girl who only wanted a little milk had given him the key to unraveling a conspiracy that threatened to destroy countless lives. The revelation that Richard was systematically targeting the wives of other businessmen transformed Arthur's personal quest for justice into an urgent mission to prevent future tragedies. The weight on his shoulders became almost unbearable. Every phone call from an acquaintance offering condolences for the death of a loved one now sounded like an alarm. The luxury market, once a symbol of abundance, now seemed like a hunting ground. And he was the only one who knew the predator's identity. His mind worked non-stop, analyzing the data his investigators sent him in encrypted reports. He cross-referenced the names Richard mentioned with the market's client lists, with recent death records, with news of sudden illnesses among high society. The pattern was undeniable and terrifying. The victims were always the wives of powerful men, men whose disappearance or emotional destabilization could benefit Richard in some way, whether through the acquisition of shares in their companies, the weakening of a competitor, or the consolidation of his own power in the business circle. Richard was reshaping the city's financial landscape, one natural death at a time. The complexity of the plan was diabolical. Richard never directly attacked the men. He targeted their hearts, their emotional pillars. He created chaos through grief, knowing that a broken man is a vulnerable man, easy to manipulate and defeat in business. Arthur's relationship with Leah and Leo deepened, becoming the center of his universe. Away from the world's cruelty, in that isolated house, they formed an unlikely family. He read stories to Leo before bedtime and marveled at how quickly the boy's health recovered. He talked with Leah, no longer as a witness, but as a confidant. The girl's sharp intelligence and her perception of human behavior were invaluable assets. She remembered details that investigators would never find, such as Richard's facial expressions when talking to different people, or subtle changes in his routine. One evening, while looking at the stars from the garden, Leah spoke in a low voice. "He thinks he's the smartest of them all," she said, referring to Richard. "He thinks no one's paying attention to the details. That's how people like him hide. They count on everyone being too busy with their own lives to notice." Her words echoed Arthur's own failure. He had been so immersed in his world of business and profits, so secure in his bubble of wealth, that he hadn't noticed the snake in his garden. The girl who possessed nothing but her ability to observe had seen what the billionaire, with all his resources, had failed to see. The investigation, however, hit a snag. Richard was meticulous. He left no digital traces, used cash for suspicious transactions, and communicated through methods that couldn't be tracked. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming, but there was still no smoking gun, no irrefutable proof that could be used in a court of law. Frustration gnawed at Arthur. He had all the money in the world, but he was stuck in a stalemate. It was then that danger dramatically approached his door. One morning, an unmarked black car pulled up in front of the property. Two men in suits emerged, accompanied by a woman with a clipboard. They were from Child Protective Services. Someone had made an anonymous complaint, alleging that two orphaned children were being held captive by a mentally unstable man. Richard's move was brilliant and terrifying. He didn't use force. He used the system itself to attack. Arthur felt panic rise, cold and sharp. He saw the fear in Leah's eyes, the same fear she had of being separated from her brother. Richard was no longer just probing, he was attacking, trying to remove the only witnesses who could destroy him. He was turning Arthur's protection into an act of kidnapping and his grief into a sign of madness. The trap was closing in, and the walls of the safe house, which once seemed like a fortress, now looked dangerously like those of a prison. The social worker's polite smile was more menacing than any weapon. She spoke in a calm, bureaucratic tone, explaining that they had a court order to assess the well-being of two children, Leah and Leo. Arthur felt the ground give way. Richard wasn't just one step ahead. He was on a completely different chessboard, using the system's rules against him. The campaign to discredit him had begun. He knew that any resistance would be interpreted as confirmation of the accusations. His obsession with control had led him to isolate the children, an act of protection that was now the main evidence against him. Leah grabbed his hand, her small fingers squeezing with surprising strength. The fear in her eyes was a reflection of Arthur's own panic. Losing those children now would be like losing Laura a second time. He took a deep breath, forcing calm into his voice. "Of course, please, come in," he said, opening the door. "The children are safe and well cared for. As you'll see." As the social worker and her companions entered, Arthur exchanged a quick glance with Leah. In that silent look, an understanding passed between them. They needed to be smarter. The truth, told plainly, would sound like a fantasy. They needed to present a plausible story that would buy them time. The interview was torture. The social worker questioned Leah and Leo separately. Arthur listened from the hallway, his heart in his throat. He marveled at Leah's composure. She didn't tell the full story of the poison and the market. Instead, she wove a narrative of two frightened children who found a kind man who offered them help when they needed it most. She spoke about her sick brother and how Uncle Arthur had brought a doctor and given them food and a safe place to stay. It was the truth, but a carefully edited version, stripped of the elements that would sound delusional. Leo, in turn, simply said he liked Arthur because he gave him ice cream and read him stories. The simplicity of his answer was disarming. The social worker seemed satisfied, but not entirely convinced. "I understand your good intentions, Mr. Sterling," she said at the end of the visit, "but standard procedure is clear. The children must be taken to a certified foster home until their situation is fully assessed." The words, "foster home," sounded like a sentence. Arthur knew that once the children were in state custody, Richard, with his connections, could make them disappear into a bureaucratic labyrinth, perhaps into a psychiatric institution from which they would never emerge. "That won't be necessary," a calm voice said from the doorway. Dr. Peterson had arrived. He held a folder and exuded quiet authority. "I am the doctor responsible for the children," he announced, "and I can attest that they are receiving exceptional medical care. Moving the boy in his fragile state of recovery would be clinically ill-advised and potentially dangerous to his health." The doctor presented reports, spoke in technical jargon about Leo's recovery from a complex nutritional deficiency syndrome, and argued vehemently that the stability of the current environment was crucial. Dr. Peterson's intervention was the move Richard hadn't foreseen. He had counted on Arthur's emotional instability, not the credibility of a respected medical professional. The social worker, confronted with the prospect of being responsible for a medical relapse, backed down. She agreed to allow the children to remain under Arthur's care on the condition of daily visits from her team. It was a victory, but Arthur knew it was only temporary. Richard had shown his hand. He was willing to use any means to silence the children. The safe house was no longer safe. They were exposed, vulnerable. That night, after the children had fallen asleep, Arthur looked at the illuminated city in the distance. He felt cornered. Legal methods were a trap. Brute force was unthinkable. He was stuck while a monster continued to weave his web. It was then that a terrible and dangerous idea began to form in his mind. If the system couldn't give him justice, perhaps he had to create his own system. If Richard wanted to play dirty, he would have to get down in the mud. And the only way to catch a predator was to set the perfect trap using the most precious bait he had. The idea, once planted, grew in Arthur's mind like a poisonous vine, intertwining with his thoughts and strangling his moral compass, using Leah and Leo as bait. The very conception of the plan disgusted him. It seemed a final betrayal of the silent vow he had made to protect them. He watched them sleep, Leah with her serene face and Leo murmuring in his dreams, and saw in them the innocence that the world, and now he himself, threatened to corrupt. How could he consciously put them in the path of a monster? Would he be any better than Richard, using children to achieve his own ends, even if those ends were justice? The night was a torture chamber for his conscience. He remembered Laura. How she always said that the true measure of a person was not in their wealth or their business, but in how they treated the most vulnerable. He was about to fail his most important test, but the alternative was paralysis. Waiting for Richard to make a mistake was a luxury they didn't have. The Child Protective Services visit was a warning shot. The next attack would be more direct, more final. Richard wouldn't stop until Leah and Leo were silenced or discredited, buried in an institution where their stories would be treated as the delusions of traumatized minds. The next morning, with deep, dark circles under his eyes and a heavy heart, he made a decision. He couldn't do this without her. He sat with Leah in the kitchen, while Leo watched cartoons in the living room. He looked into the girl's eyes, which had already seen more darkness than most adults. "Leah," he began, his voice hoarse, "we are in danger. What we did yesterday with the social worker only bought us a little time. Richard will try again." Leah simply nodded, her face serious. "I know," she said simply. "People like him don't give up." Her calm acceptance disarmed him. "I have a plan to stop him," Arthur continued, "but it's dangerous, and it involves you and Leo. I won't do anything unless you understand and agree. You have the right to say no." He explained the idea in simple terms, to create a controlled situation where Richard, believing they were vulnerable, would be lured into a trap and forced to confess, with everything being recorded. Leah listened in silence, her gaze never wavering. When he finished, she showed no fear. Instead, there was a spark of determination in her eyes. "We're not bait," she said, correcting him with a wisdom that shocked him. "We're the trap. He thinks we're weak because we're kids. That's why it'll work. He won't expect us to fight back." In that moment, the dynamic between them changed forever. She was no longer just a child he was protecting. She was his partner, his ally in this war. Her courage solidified Arthur's resolve, transforming his plan from an act of desperation into a calculated strategy. Confirmation that they were on the right track came that same afternoon. One of his security guards, performing a routine electronic sweep, found a tiny listening device cleverly hidden in the base of a lamp in the living room. It was sophisticated, military grade. Richard wasn't just observing from afar, he was listening to every word, every plan. The air in the house seemed to grow thin. They weren't in a fortress, they were in an aquarium with the sharks circling outside. The time for hesitation was over. The plan was set in motion. Arthur, knowing he was being listened to, made a call to Dr. Peterson, staging a conversation filled with panic. He spoke about Leah's instability, her fanciful tales, and scheduled an appointment with a renowned child psychiatrist for the next day at a clinic across town. It was the perfect bait. Arthur, the protector, finally succumbing to pressure, doubting the child's sanity, exactly as Richard wanted. The trap was set. Now, they just had to wait for the predator to bite. The wait was the hardest part. Every hour that passed was an eternity. Finally, in the early evening, Arthur's cell phone rang. The name on the screen made his heart stop. Richard. Richard's voice on the other end of the line was pure silk, a sweet poison of feigned concern. "Arthur, my friend, I just heard you're taking the girl to a psychiatrist. I'm sorry you're going through this. I warned you her story was unproblematic." The words were perfectly calibrated to sound sympathetic, but Arthur, now attuned to the dissonance, could hear the exultation underneath. Richard had bitten the bait. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Richard," Arthur replied, injecting the exact amount of exhaustion and doubt into his voice. "She's so convincing, but the things she says about you, it's crazy." He needed to inflate Richard's ego, make him feel safe, invincible. I know. Look, maybe I can help," Richard said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Don't take the girl to the clinic. It's a public place, full of people. The stress might be too much for her. Why don't we meet somewhere more private? I have a friend who's an excellent therapist. We can talk, the three of us. Maybe I can calm her down. Show her I'm not the person she imagines." The trap was closing. Richard didn't want Leah to talk to an independent professional. He wanted to control the situation, isolate them, and finish what he had started. He suggested a location, an abandoned warehouse belonging to one of his shell companies in the waterfront district. It was the perfect place for a kidnapping or something worse. "I don't know, Richard." Arthur feigned hesitation. "It's all right, Arthur. Trust me." "This time," Richard said. And the irony of the statement was almost suffocating. The next day was a choreography of tension. Arthur and his team worked frantically to prepare the warehouse. Miniature cameras and microphones were hidden in beams and crates. Expert marksmen, hired from the best private security firm, were positioned on adjacent rooftops. Every detail was planned and rehearsed. The risk was astronomical. If something went wrong, Leah and Leo would be in the line of fire. The responsibility weighed on Arthur like a mountain. As dusk fell, they departed. Leah was quiet in the back seat, holding Leo's hand. She wore a small butterfly brooch on her dress, a gift from Arthur. Inside the butterfly, there was a high-powered microphone and a GPS tracker. She wasn't a victim, she was a soldier. They arrived at the warehouse as the sun set, painting the sky orange and purple. The place was cavernous and echoed, full of dancing shadows. Richard was already there, alone, standing in the center of the vast space. The smile on his face was that of a predator who had cornered his prey. "Arthur, I'm glad you came," he said, his eyes shifting from Arthur to the children. "Leah, darling, I heard you've been telling some stories about me." Leah took a step forward, her small figure appearing incredibly fragile in the enormous warehouse, but her voice was firm. "They're not stories," she said. "I saw you. I saw the little white powder you put in the pretty lady's juice." Richard laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Arthur, see, her imagination is vivid. That's why we need to help her." He approached, his mask of concern beginning to slip. "Leah, you and your brother need a special place to get well, a quiet place where no one will bother you with these ideas anymore." The veiled threat hung in the air, cold and sharp. It was time. "Why did you do it?" "Richard?" Arthur asked, his voice finally shedding all pretense, sounding hard and cold. "Laura, she loved you like a brother." Richard's expression changed. The smile disappeared, replaced by a calculating coldness. "Love? Laura was an obstacle. She made you weak, sentimental, all of them, all the wives. They were dead weight, distractions from the real game. Power, control, legacy. I wasn't just getting rid of them, Arthur. I was liberating you all. Liberating you." The confession was more monstrous than Arthur could have imagined. It wasn't about money. It was about a sick obsession with him, a twisted vision of friendship that demanded the annihilation of all other bonds. "I did it for us, Arthur," Richard continued, his eyes glowing with a fanatical fervor, "so we could build our empire without distractions. And now, all that's left are these last two." He took a step towards Leah, his hand moving towards his coat pocket, and in that instant, Arthur's world narrowed to that single movement, that single, terrible moment where everything could be lost. Time seemed to slow. The movement of Richard's hand towards his pocket was the trigger that broke the paralyzing tension. Before Arthur could react, something unexpected happened. Leah didn't flinch. She took another step forward, deliberately placing herself between Richard and her brother. "You won't hurt Leo," she said, her voice resonating with an authority that defied her size. "You're just a bully. You think you're strong because you hurt people who can't defend themselves. But you're not strong. You're weak, and you're scared." The accusation coming from a 6-year-old child hit Richard with a force no physical threat could have. His facade of control shattered, revealing the pathetic, insecure man beneath. His anger, previously cold and calculating, exploded into uncontrollable fury. "You little..." he snarled, finally pulling his hand from his pocket, but he wasn't holding a weapon. It was a syringe filled with a clear liquid, a sedative. His plan had never been to kill the children there, but to take them, to permanently silence them somewhere distant. In that moment, the blinding lights of tactical spotlights flooded the warehouse, bathing the scene in a merciless white light. Metal doors slid open on all sides, and armed security teams advanced, their weapons pointed at Richard. The sound of a hovering helicopter filled the space. The trap had closed. Richard froze, the syringe in his hand, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He looked at Arthur, betrayal etched on his face. "You," he whispered, the word laden with hatred. "It was all a trick." "It was justice," Arthur corrected, his voice echoing in the tense silence. He walked until he stood beside Leah, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "Every word you said was recorded, every crime you confessed." Uniformed police officers, led by a trusted detective Arthur had contacted through secret channels, entered and handcuffed a shocked and defeated Richard. As they led him away, his eyes met Arthur's for the last time. In them, there was no remorse, only the emptiness of a man whose obsession had consumed him completely. The victory, however, did not bring the euphoria Arthur expected. Instead, an overwhelming wave of relief and a deep sadness washed over him. He looked at the empty space where Richard had stood and felt the weight of years of friendship disintegrate into dust. The truth had set him free, but it had also left him with scars that would never disappear. He knelt in front of Leah and hugged her tightly. "You were the bravest person I've ever known," he whispered into her hair. She hugged him back, and for the first time since he had met her, he felt her relax, her small body finally allowing itself to simply be a child. The resolution of the conflicts began that very night, but it was a gradual process. Richard's recorded confession, combined with Leo's toxicology reports and the evidence collected by Arthur's investigators, formed an unassailable case. The poisoning scheme was fully exposed, and the news shocked the city and the nation. The investigation expanded, revealing the true scale of Richard's crimes and saving potential future victims. Justice for Laura and Leah's mother was on its way, but Arthur's most important victory did not happen in a courtroom. It happened in the days and weeks that followed. He began the legal process to adopt Leah and Leo, not out of a sense of duty, but out of a genuine love that had grown between them. He realized they had saved him as much as he had saved them. They filled the void in his life with a purpose that no fortune could buy. He sold his stake in the company he built with Richard, severing the last tie to his treacherous past. He used a significant portion of his capital to create a foundation dedicated to protecting orphan child witnesses of crimes, providing them with security, legal, and psychological support. He transformed tragedy into a legacy of hope, ensuring that Leah's courage was not in vain. The guest house, once a temporary refuge, became a home. The pain of Laura's loss would never completely disappear, but now it was intertwined with a new kind of love, a new family forged in adversity. 4 weeks later, Arthur Sterling pushed a grocery cart through the same dairy aisle. The air was still cold, the hum of the refrigerators the same, but everything in his world had changed. Beside him, Leah skipped along, pushing her own mini-cart with playful seriousness, while Leo, seated in Arthur's main cart, babbled happily, pointing at colorful boxes. They had come back here on purpose, not to confront a ghost, but to rewrite a memory, to transform a somber meeting place into a landmark of their new beginning. Arthur was no longer the haunted man who wandered these aisles. The pain of betrayal still existed, a scar on his soul, but it was no longer an open wound. The truth about Laura, though devastating, had freed him from the prison of a perfect but false memory. He now remembered her with bittersweet clarity, a brilliant, loving woman who had also been a victim, deceived just like him. Justice for her was being served, and that brought a dark peace. His vast wealth, once a tool of control and isolation, now had a purpose. The best investment of his life had not been in tech stocks or cryptocurrencies. It had been in a foundation that now gave voice and security to children who, like Leah, saw things no adult believed. Leah stopped in front of the yogurts and placed several strawberry containers in her cart. "Leo likes these," she declared, with the authority of an older sister who knew all the world's secrets. The weight of survival was no longer on her shoulders. Her eyes, once so serious and perceptive, now shone with the carefree light of childhood. She laughed easily, told bad jokes, and worried about things like which ice cream flavor was best, not about what secret she could trade for food. Leo, now with rosy cheeks and a strong body, was living proof of recovery. He was no longer the fragile, feverish figure on the dirty mattress, but a curious, energetic boy whose trust in Arthur was total and unconditional. He was the promise of a future that had almost been stolen from them. Arthur's transformation was the deepest of all. He had discovered that true wealth was not in his assets or his cash flow, but in the feeling of Leo's small hand in his finger and the sound of Leah's laughter. He had learned that absolute control was an illusion and that true strength lay in vulnerability, in the ability to trust again, even after the deepest of betrayals. They reached the end of the aisle, stopping in front of the whole milk shelf, the exact spot where everything began. For a moment, the three stood in silence. It wasn't an awkward silence, but one of shared recognition. Leah looked at the milk cartons, then at Arthur, and a small smile formed on her lips. She didn't need to say anything. In that look was their entire journey, the fear, the courage, the loss, and the rediscovery. Arthur knelt down, meeting her gaze. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer hid. "You saved me, Leah." She simply nodded, as if that were the most obvious truth in the world. He picked up a carton of milk and placed it in the cart, a simple act that was now a symbol of their family. As they left the gourmet market, under the warm sunlight, with a child in each hand, Arthur Sterling, the former solitary billionaire, felt like the richest man in the world. He, who believed he could buy anything, had discovered that the most precious things, truth, justice, and love, were priceless. They were gifts, sometimes offered in the most unexpected places by a little girl who just wanted a bit of milk in exchange for a secret that could save the world.